In Appalachia, there was a man that the locals referred to as Elias Crow. He lived alone deep in the hills, only coming down to town occasionally to sell cured furs and gather basic supplies. And on these trips he spoke very little, usually muttering incomprehensibly or grunting as he walked through the streets. Most townspeople, they just avoided him entirely, treating him as unpredictable, though the owner of the hardware store kept a neutral relationship due to the consistent quality of the furs that he sold. Red Hollow was a small mining and logging community here, quiet except for the occasional discussion of neighbors' affairs. And when Crow came into town, his presence sparked conversation all the time, and every visit renewed speculation about his solitary life. One winter evening, the hardware store owner noted that Crow hadn't appeared in town for weeks. A few of the regulars suggested that they should investigate the man's residence to see if the rumors held any weight. The following morning, a small group set out on foot, led by the store owner. Elias Crow's home was well beyond the edge of the main road, nestled into a narrow valley with steep rocky sides. The stream running through it was dark from the runoff from old mining tunnels upstream. Local children had always been warned to stay away, and older boys occasionally dared each other to approach during the height of gossip season. The holler itself was pretty rough terrain, though, and the group had to follow the stream through uneven ground to reach the shack. The shack? It was small, too, constructed of rough-hewn timber and tar paper by the looks of it. A smaller detached structure set nearby as well, nondescript at first glance. The store owner pushed open the main door, revealing a sparsely furnished interior. The fireplace still contained faintly glowing coals, which meant that somebody had been here. There was nothing overtly alarming, and most of the group honestly felt pretty disappointed. A few of them, especially those more cautious, considered the visit proof enough that Crow was mostly harmless. The youngest in the group, however, he wanted to investigate the old outbuilding, and inside, he found a more unusual arrangement. There were bones positioned deliberately in there, pointed toward a single shelf, and on the shelf, well, there were 3 human skulls, cleaned and carefully placed between 2 partially burned candles. Upon seeing this, the group instantly froze. The setup was clearly intentional, and definitely not a casual collection. At that moment, too, they heard low, guttural sounds coming from the direction of the main shack. The group debated whether to confront Crow or to retreat, and given how familiar he was with the terrain, they unanimously chose to leave immediately. They made their way back down the valley, hearing some indistinct movement behind them at points, though it was pretty unclear if Crow was actually following them or not. The group, they never did return to the holler, and Crow himself was never seen in town again. They did report it to local authorities, who went there, but by the time that the police showed up, the entire place, it had been burned down. The incident remained part of local history here, passed down by the older residents as a warning about curiosity and isolation. Later, though, my grandfather, who grew up in Red Hollow, he recounted this story along with others from the town, and he remembered seeing Crow in town on rare occasions, handling furs at the hardware store, and hearing all of the rumors about him. While some details have faded over time, the story of the hollow, the shack, and the subjects inside has persisted in local memory here for sure. Crow's disappearance and the shrine arrangement obviously is extremely suspicious. The authorities never found any bones or anything too, which I don't know too much about whether a fire would be hot enough to consume them or whatever, or maybe he took them with him or something. Either way, the authorities never found anything, and so the investigation, it became a bit of a dead end. So, several days a week, I was responsible for collecting my younger brother from his school at the time. He was 8 years old, and our parents worked pretty late, and the arrangement had been routine for over a year without any issues. The area was considered pretty low risk, with minimal crime and a strong sense of community. Children, they frequently walked unoccupied here, and it was not unusual for families to leave doors unlocked during the day too. The route from the school to our house involved a gradual incline through a residential zone, followed by a longer descent along a service road bordering undeveloped land. The descent was poorly illuminated. There were streetlights at the top and the bottom, but the central stretch, maybe about 400 meters, had no lighting at all really. During the winter months too, this section was pretty much fully dark by late afternoon. Now, on the day in question, nothing stood out initially, and my brother and I left the school grounds at the usual time like we always did. He was talking about a classroom issue or something, I think, and I was sort of paying partial attention while scanning traffic, as I normally do. We reached the top of the incline and began down the unlit road, and within seconds of entering that stretch, I got a really bad feeling. Something just wasn't right, and I couldn't immediately put my finger on it or see what it was, but I just felt weird. There was no noise and no visible movement anywhere, and no change in the surrounding or anything. But the reaction that I had was instinctual, I suppose. I felt tense all of a sudden, and I was urgently sort of looking around, trying to assess the environment around us, but I couldn't see anything. I stopped walking, though, and we turned around for a bit. Maybe about 20 to 25 meters behind us was an adult woman walking in our direction. I hadn't seen her earlier or heard anyone approach prior to that moment. Given the narrowness of the road and the absence of the side paths, though, this was pretty unexpected. The woman appeared elderly, possibly in her late 60s or older, based on her posture and her gait. But what stood out the most was her speed. She was moving faster than what should have been typical for someone of her apparent age, particularly on a downhill grade. And when she noticed that I had turned around, she altered her facial expression in a way that suggested deliberate acknowledgement rather than casual reaction, and she smiled. But the expression didn't appear friendly or neutral or even normal. It was sustained, direct and incongruent with the situation altogether. I didn't interpret it as a social gesture at all in the end, and I didn't respond. At that point, I resumed walking without any comment. I did not want to alert my brother, as I didn't want to provoke panic or slow our pace through confusion or anything. I mean, our house was less than 5 minutes away at this point. After about 10 more seconds, I made the decision to change behavior without explanation, though, and I instructed my brother to run and took his hand to ensure compliance. He hesitated briefly, but he followed pretty quickly. I looked back once, and this woman was no longer walking. She had increased speed significantly and was closing the distance. And in her right hand, she was holding an object that reflected faint ambient light, and based on the shape and the grip, I could tell that it was a kitchen knife or something similar. There was no verbal exchange. She didn't shout or signal. The behavior suggested pursuit rather than coincidence, and we reached our property gate shortly afterward, and I opened it, directed my brother inside, and secured it immediately. I also remained at the gate momentarily to verify that it had been latched correctly. From inside of the property, I observed the woman stop on the opposite side of the fence, and I could see her 2 lower legs through the gap beneath the gate, and they were completely hairy. She didn't attempt to climb or force entry or anything, and she remained stationary for a short period, likely under a minute, I would say, before she left the area. But before she left, I noticed something strange about her appearance. Her face looked really weird. In fact, upon reflection, I think that she was wearing a mask. She left, and no further contact occurred, thankfully, but the incident was reported by my parents that evening, and they contacted local authorities, but no matching individual was ever identified, and no similar reports were shared with us afterward. We altered our routine permanently after that, though, and I no longer walked that route alone with my brother anymore, too. Thankfully, we got away that day, but Sometimes I look back on that moment and I think, what if she had caught up to us? What would she have done? And was she even a she? Late December of 2019, while I was staying overnight at my partner's relative's home in southern Germany, the house was pretty unfamiliar to me and we were sleeping in a guest room that we'd only used for about 2 nights. Now, at about 3 in the morning, I became aware of movement in the room. My partner got out of bed to use the bathroom. I was not fully asleep or fully awake at that point, but I clearly observed him stand up and leave the room. The door opened and closed even, and this part is important because it anchors the experience to an external stimulus. You see, after he left, I noticed that the room felt colder than before. The window was open slightly, which I remembered agreeing to earlier despite preferring it to be closed. I considered getting up to shut it, but I hesitated because I felt physically heavy all of a sudden and sort of mentally foggy, similar to the sensation of drifting back into sleep. But at some point after that decision, I experienced what felt like standing up, moving across the room and closing the window. The sequence was coherent and continuous, and I recall stepping carefully, touching the frame and returning to the bed. There were no visual distortions that suggested dreaming. Everything appeared consistent with the room layout. When I lay back down, I felt extremely drowsy again, and within seconds I felt an arm extend toward me from behind, resting in the familiar position my partner uses when initiating physical contact during sleep. This is a habitual gesture between us, which is why I reacted automatically by reaching back. While touching the arm, I became aware of a contradiction though. You see, my partner should still have been in the bathroom, and that realization triggered an immediate stress response. I sat upright quickly and pulled the arm toward me to identify its source. At that moment, I saw that the arm was disconnected from any body. There was no resistance consistent with a person lying next to me, and without consciously deciding to speak, I said a name associated with a deceased relative, followed immediately by a second unfamiliar name that I had never used before, and also have not been able to recall since. There was no emotional attachment to the names. They surfaced reflexively. Immediately afterward, I felt a physical sensation consistent with being pushed backward onto the mattress. The motion was abrupt and resulted in a brief loss of awareness too. When consciousness returned, I was laying on my back, breathing rapidly. The first thing that I did was I looked toward the window and it was still open. This directly contradicted my memory of getting up and closing it, obviously. Seconds later, I heard the bathroom door open and my partner returning to the room. The timeline indicated that he had never left the bathroom during that experience. Now, physiologically, I experienced fear symptoms. I was sweating, I had a lingering sense of panic, all that. These subsided gradually over the next several minutes, but I was able to move freely and speak normally after waking. In the following hours, I replayed the sequence repeatedly in my head, primarily because the event began with a verified external trigger and transitioned seamlessly into what I can only say is a false sequence of actions. But the realism of the sensations made it difficult to classify it as just a typical dream. I guess the key factor is that the experience ended when full consciousness resumed and no elements of it persisted beyond that moment. I didn't experience anything afterwards too, no reoccurring episodes and no external evidence to it either. And while I'm not completely sure what happened there, I know that I saw my partner get up and go to the bathroom, and I'm pretty sure that I went to that window and closed it. In fact, when I woke up, I was in the position that I had been in when I was pushed at the last second in that dream state or whatever it was. Understanding that makes me think that the whole thing wasn't a dream and that Something very weird happened that night. This happened when I was in year 4, living with my family on the outskirts of Brasov, Romania. The area was semi-rural, with dense forested land extending up to the edge of residential zones and public infrastructure. My primary school sat at the boundary between developed land and some unmanaged woodland. The campus was enclosed by a chain-link fence with a locked service gate on the rear side. Beyond the fence, there was a narrow maintenance strip, followed by open grassland and then uninterrupted forest. The students, they were explicitly prohibited from approaching the fence after 2 prior incidences involving children leaving school grounds during recess. Those incidents too occurred the year before I enrolled. The 2 boys from an older class, they climbed the fence and entered the tree line. The teachers noticed within minutes, thankfully, but locating them took longer than expected. When they were brought back, one of the boys showed visible signs of distress, though. He didn't describe what had happened and transferred school shortly afterward. After that, though, recess supervision increased and access to the field adjacent to the woods was revoked entirely. Despite the restrictions, though, the wooded area remained within sight and hearing distance of the schoolyard. On certain days, ambient noise would drop suddenly as well, and during these intervals, sounds carried unusually well. Students and staff occasionally reported hearing low mechanical noises resembling engines, despite no nearby industrial sites. Other times, the sounds resembled footsteps moving through the undergrowth. No animals were ever observed at those moments, though, and no maintenance activity was scheduled during those school hours. But because both of my parents worked late, I attended the after-school supervision program several days a week there. Staffing during those hours was pretty minimal, to be honest, typically overseen by university students training as educators, really. When weather allowed, we were taken to the older sports court on the opposite side of the campus, farther from the tree line. I never participated in group games, and usually I just remained seated near the edge of the court. But on one occasion in the early autumn, while facing the wooded boundary, I experienced what I can only describe as a brief episode of tinnitus, accompanied by just a sensation of pressure or something. At the same time, I observed the perimeter fence vibrating in a sort of localized section. There was no wind that day, and nobody was near the fence. When I turned away, the vibration ceased. But moments later, the supervisor called everyone inside due to a head count discrepancy, and a separate incident occurred later that term during an extended recess period. Staffing was reduced to a single teacher, and one student, a girl from my class, was unaccounted for during a routine roll call. The class searched all standard areas: bathrooms, classrooms, the gym. The woods were not checked due to policy, but maybe about 15 minutes later, the student was found seated near a side entrance that had been checked multiple times already. She claimed that she hadn't moved, and upon being located, she began crying and was unable to explain where she had been. Later, she attributed her reaction to an argument with another student, though no one present recalled a conflict severe enough to justify her response. At the time, these events were treated as just sort of unrelated, but in hindsight, they share common situational factors: limited supervision, transitional periods, environments that encourage misinterpretation of sensory experiences. The children lingering near restricted areas, too, were likely responding to curiosity amplified by the prior warnings and the rumors that were going around. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that, but while the experiences were pretty unsettling at the time, particularly for us kids, we got over it for the most part, and like I said, nothing ever really happened again. But the memories of that moment, they remain very vivid for me because they occurred during my formative years and were reinforced by a lot of uncertainty around it, and mostly because no one could really explain what had happened to that little girl. For some context, I have extensive experience in outdoor environments. I grew up in a very rural area, spent most of my childhood in forests and on rivers, and later worked seasonal jobs that involved overnight stays in undeveloped land. I'm pretty familiar with wildlife behavior, low light perception issues, and how stress alters interpretation as well. I'm also not prone to fear responses from unfamiliar sounds or movement. So, in October of 2014, my partner and I rented a short-term cabin at a public campground in southern Poland, close to a managed forest zone. The site was not remote. There was road access, mobile reception, and other campers as well, though occupancy was low due to the season, obviously. Our cabin was the last in a small row and bordered directly against a tree line used for forestry access. The first evening was pretty uneventful too. We cooked outdoors that day, noted some activity from rodents, distant dogs, wind through the trees, and went inside at about 10:30. The cabin had a small covered entryway though with a single exterior light, and after going inside, I stepped back out to take a phone call. While pacing the length of the entryway, I reached the side closet to the forest boundary and sort of stopped abruptly. The reason was not the sound or movement, but it was the contrast. At the edge of the light spill, roughly 2 meters from the porch, I registered a shape that didn't align with the surrounding vegetation or the terrain. The object, whatever it was low to the ground, upright and stationary. Based on perspective and reference points, it must have been under a meter in height, and it didn't reflect the light like fur or leaves and appeared sort of uniformly dull in tone. I couldn't identify limbs, facial features, or clothing at first. It didn't advance, retreat, or shift position. In fact, it was like perfectly still. Obviously, I didn't approach it, and I stepped backward into the cabin while maintaining visual contact. During this moment, my phone call disconnected, and my partner immediately noticed the change in my behavior and asked what was wrong. I didn't provide a detailed explanation at that moment. We just secured the door and we remained inside. Now, about 20 minutes later, I returned to the porch with a stronger light source. The area where the object had been was now empty. There were no visible tracks, disturbances, or sounds, and we didn't hear movement during the interval. Eventually, I took my mind off of it after a cup of tea and just sort of sitting down and watching some things, and then we went to bed and I didn't think too much of it. Now, the following day proceeded pretty normally until early afternoon. While inside the cabin, we experienced this sort of intense vibration accompanied by sustained low-frequency noises. The entire cabin was rattling, and the sound pressure was significant enough to really cause us discomfort. We exited the cabin along with several other campers to try to determine the source. The disturbance was caused by multiple military aircraft flying at really low altitude. The aircraft passed overhead several times before leaving the area too. We eventually went back inside after some brief discussion with these nearby neighbors, and I would say probably at around 8 o'clock I went out for a smoke on the porch again. And as I was sitting there, the entire night just sort of went completely still. What I mean is that there was no wind, there was no sound of any animals around, the rustling of leaves just completely left. It was almost like I was suddenly in a vacuum, without any sound whatsoever. It was really weird, and obviously at the time I was sort of weirded out by it, and so I got up and started heading back inside. But when I did, I could have sworn that I saw a face behind one of the trees in the nearby forest there, almost exactly where I saw whatever it was the day before. Now, I don't want to sound crazy, but genuinely, the best way to describe this face was like one of those little grey aliens that you see in films and online all the time. I only saw it for a brief moment, and man did it move quickly, but upon seeing it, I didn't waste any time and I immediately went back inside. Nothing happened that night as far as I know of, and we departed the campground shortly afterward. My partner didn't want to, but I was way too scared at this point to stick around, and so we ended up leaving in the end. I really have no idea what that was, and it was a brief encounter, so I really can't be sure as to what I actually saw that day. And so I try not to interpret it as like aliens or anything, but still, for as long as I live, I will never, ever forget that face behind that tree that night. Before coal mining became a local industry, the valley near Ironwood, Kentucky was used by Native Americans for seasonal hunting and livestock management too. By the time that my family settled there in the early 1900s, only traces remained, mostly arrowheads, pottery fragments, and a few worn paths through the woods too. My grandfather often explored the surrounding forest and hills during hunting trips. He was used to finding artifacts too, but he also had a habit of investigating unusual terrain, including small rock outcrops, nature shelters, and cave entrances too. On one trip in the late 1930s, he discovered a narrow opening partway up the ridge in the eastern hills. The entrance was hidden by undergrowth and rockfall, but just wide enough for a person to crawl through. He returned home that day to plan a proper exploration, and brought his younger brother along the following weekend. They carried a candle for light and a small pack of tools. Crawling through the opening was pretty difficult, and they had to move slowly to avoid scraping themselves against the rough stone walls. The first chamber was low but spacious enough for both to kneel in. They set the candle on a flat rock to illuminate the walls and noticed crude drawings of large animals, all oriented toward a narrow tunnel deeper inside. The next section of the cave was even tighter though. They could stand in it but not turn around very easily, and as they progressed, the ceiling rose slightly too, and a second chamber opened up. At that point, the candlelight revealed a figure emerging from the rock face, and at first my grandfather thought that it was another explorer or maybe a hunter, but the figure remained perfectly still. It was humanoid, proportionally correct in form, but its presence was unusual, as how he put it. As they drew closer, they realized that the figure, it had no head, and seemed to be carved directly from the stone wall. The sculpture, which is what it looked like, extended several feet above their height, with smooth features on the front and rough, unfinished edges on the back. The neck had a jagged break where the head would have been, but the rest of the form was remarkably well defined. My grandfather later explained that the figure felt threatening when they first saw it, and created a sense of imbalance as though the space itself was reacting to their presence. He and his brother didn't linger, they retreated carefully, leaving the candle behind. But as they were leaving, they both said that they heard whispering noises coming from deep in the cave somewhere, saying that it sounded like it was coming beyond where the statue was. They couldn't quite pinpoint where the sound was coming from because of all the echoing in this cave, but they were sure that they were hearing what sounded like somebody speaking, and it sounded like a language, but they couldn't be sure. Either way, upon hearing that, they quickly got out of there, scraping themselves on the way out in the hurry that they were in. My grandfather has passed away since he told me this story, but it's something that I never forgot, and when the property eventually left the family, apparently the cave remained undisturbed and hidden in the hills, preserved by the natural environment, I suppose. After all, it was pretty hard to find. I really don't know what to make of this story, to be honest. My grandfather certainly wasn't the sort of person to lie or make up stories like this, so I believe him, but exactly what it was, well, even he didn't know. So I keep a field log for solo rides and hikes, mostly to track routes, weather, and changes in the terrain here. This entry was from early January of 2024, during a winter survey ride. The area that I was in sits between farmland and a motorway corridor, with long abandoned logging tracks and unmanaged woodland. Conditions that day were pretty unusually cold for the region. Overnight temperatures were well below freezing, in fact, which eliminated the persistent mud that had made the area pretty difficult to navigate, well, in previous weeks anyway. Visibility was clear despite a reoccurring fog pattern in the valley below. Fog had been present daily since the last new moon, including that morning, but it didn't extend into the ridge elevation, and I noted the pattern without drawing conclusions. Upon arrival, ambient noise was minimal, wind was negligible, traffic from the nearby autobahn was intermittently audible, depending on direction and elevation that you were at. Wildlife activity? It appeared low that day, which was consistent with the temperature in that time of year. I stopped first at an open meadow where I had previously documented several small wooden structures constructed from small branches. They were sort of loosely stacked, resembling makeshift shelters or marker piles maybe, rather than permanent structures. But on initial inspection I thought that one had been altered, but a later photo comparison showed no measurable change. The difference appeared to be lighting and shadow angle, probably due to an earlier arrival time. I continued along the track and passed a second structure further down slope. This one appeared more compact and partially collapsed, consistent with snow load and freeze-thaw cycles. I recorded photographs and GPS coordinates as I usually did, and later I decided to revisit a wooden depression that I had last entered the previous year, during an October full moon. The trail leading down is pretty narrow, steep, and heavily shaded, with limited sightlines, and from the ridge, the area appeared significantly darker than the surrounding forest, likely due to the canopy density and slope orientation. Now, before descending, I paused longer than I usually did. I experienced a strong reluctance to go forward, which I attributed to a combination of fatigue, low temperature, isolation, and memory of prior difficulty navigating that section. But despite this, I proceeded anyway. As I entered the lower section, I became increasingly alert, though. My body's response was notable, too. I suddenly had an elevated heart rate. I felt tense, and my auditory sensitivity went up. These reactions were disproportionate to immediate stimuli, but explainable by stress responses in an isolated environment, I suppose. But maybe about halfway down, I heard movement in the dense brush to my right. The sound was heavy and irregular, consistent with a large animal or maybe a person moving through the undergrowth. Visibility was very limited. No visual confirmation followed, and I dismounted and scanned the area without approaching the sound source. At this point, I experienced a really strong feeling as to not use my headlamp or move toward that noise. This was a conscious decision, based on the risk assessment rather than fear, I suppose. In low visibility terrain like this, illuminating oneself can reduce situational awareness rather than improve it. So I remained stationary for several minutes, and during that time I noticed displaced leaves and branches further down slope, suggesting recent movement, though direction and cause were pretty unclear. There was no vocalizations, shadows, or follow-up sounds after that. I chose to stop and eat, partly to regulate stress and also partly to avoid rushing a decision. I sat on a nearby tree stump and ate the food that I had packed. I also poured a small amount of alcohol onto the ground, not as a ritual, but because the flask had leaked slightly and I chose not to carry excess liquid back uphill. Following this pause, though, my body's response seemed to normalize. The environment didn't change, but I guess my perception must have, but after that, there were no further sounds. I completed the additional documentation, and then I began to exit the area. And I must have been about maybe halfway up the track when I turned around to take one last glance at the area. And when I did, I saw the strangest thing. There was this completely white creature that looked so thin that it was almost just bone. It was standing off to the right near some bushes and some trees, but I only saw it for a brief moment before I just took off running because whatever the heck that was, it was not normal. I'll try to describe it briefly as I got a pretty good look at it, but I didn't see it for too long. So it was completely emaciated, completely white as white paper in fact. It had a sort of boxy look to it, or rectangular in shape, elongated arms down to its knees, and it had these large black eyes that sort of looked like they were almost popping out of its head. I would also say that it was probably about 7 feet tall from what I could see, and it moved very quickly, and I only caught a glimpse of it before it just disappeared. On the return route, I scrambled back, and I was huffing and puffing, but I also noticed that the ambient noise, it resumed gradually. The wind picked up slightly, distant traffic became more consistent, and after that there was nothing else that really happened. This experience reinforced for me that we really don't know what's out there just yet, at least not completely. I won't be returning to that area because whatever that was, it looked dangerous, and I won't be taking my chances, that's for sure. But I do have the area marked out on my GPS locations, and so I guess if somebody else wants to go and visit it at some stage, I could give them the coordinates to go and take a look. So I was returning alone to my residence on the opposite side of town one night. A scheduled infrastructure project had closed several roads that took me back to my place, but that forced traffic into a temporary sort of loop system there. After multiple unsuccessful attempts to re-enter the main route, I followed a posted detour that led away from the residential areas and into an agricultural corridor with adjacent forest. My mobile reception dropped within minutes. This wasn't completely unexpected. Coverage in that area has gaps due to terrain and distance from towers, after all. I had driven through the area before during daylight hours, though rarely ever at night. The road ran straight for several kilometers, though, alongside unmanaged woodland. There were no houses, no footpaths, and no visible access points. Due to uncertainty about upcoming turns and the absence of navigation data, I reduced speed significantly. Less than a minute after entering this stretch, I heard a sharp metallic impact against the rear left side of the vehicle. The sound was distinct from road debris or tire contact. It was abrupt and directional, consistent with an object striking the car from the side rather than the vehicle hitting something on the ground. It even sort of buffered the car a little bit. I braked and stopped immediately, pulling onto the shoulder where there was some lighting overhead. I remained inside the vehicle, though. Exiting the car didn't seem like a good idea given the location, the time, and also the lack of visibility. While adjusting the mirrors to assess damage, I noticed an object lying in the roadway behind the car. Under the streetlight, it appeared to be a steel wrench, medium-sized, placed or dropped there, it seemed, rather than shattered or bent from impact. Its position aligned with the sound that I had heard earlier, but before attempting to really document it, my attention was drawn to movement across the road. The streetlight illuminated several meters into the forest edge, and within that lit boundary, I saw a person standing just off of the asphalt. The individual was facing away from the road, oriented directly into the trees, and the person didn't step forward or backward, but shifted slightly, enough for me to register the posture and the clothing. The person appeared male, average height, wearing a dark jacket and neutral clothing, some colored trousers as well, and the hair color was difficult to determine under the lighting conditions, but appeared light. The skin tone, where visible at the neck and the hands, was pale. Arms were held straight at the sides, and there was repeated hand movement, opening and closing without any larger body motion. No attempt was made to approach the car from what I could see. The individual didn't turn around. There was no vocalization, gesture, or visible tools or anything. At that moment, the absence of other vehicles became way more significant for me. The road was otherwise completely empty. There were no parked cars, bicycles, or nearby dwellings that would reasonably explain someone standing in that location at that time. I didn't wait for further clarification. I realigned my mirrors as best as I could and left the area immediately, accelerating until I reached a populated zone with reliable lighting and traffic. But as I left, I looked into the rearview mirror, and that's when I noticed that there was more than just one person there. In fact, several people stepped out of the darkness and onto the light of the road as I was leaving. I'm pretty sure that that was a setup and that those people were waiting for me to step out of my vehicle. Boy, am I glad that I never did. By the time that this situation stopped developing, it had been ongoing for close to 18 months, though the most disruptive incidents were concentrated within the first year. As of now, there has been no confirmed activity connected to it for roughly 8 months, which is the only reason that I considered it resolved rather than ongoing. So, in early 2023, I was living in a rental property in suburban eastern Colorado, just outside of a mid-sized city. I was 21 years old, sharing the house with a close friend of the same age. The neighborhood was generally stable, families, long-term residents, minimal reported crime. Rent was pretty high, maintenance response was pretty slow, and interaction with the property owner was limited to automated messages and occasional inspections. The structure itself had a partially underground lower level, accessible only from the exterior. That space was unfinished and pretty irregular. According to the landlord, the house had sustained damage years earlier when a large tree fell near the foundation or something, resulting in structural modifications that apparently left a sizable crawl void along the rear wall. The area was not sealed in a conventional manner too. The basement contained 2 water heaters, one active, one disconnected and unused, along with some stored items of minimal value. We did not routinely access the space, and initially we just sort of kept it unlocked. Now, the backyard was enclosed by a low fence. I owned a medium-sized herding dog that had unrestricted access to the yard during the day through a doggy door. The dog was non-aggressive but vocal, but also not very protective. Also, located in the yard was a deteriorating storage structure left by a previous owner or something. It was no longer in use, though, and contained nothing of significance. Several months into the lease, one of our adjacent neighbors, whose spouse worked in law enforcement, approached me to report an interaction that had occurred earlier that afternoon. A man driving an older pickup truck, he had entered our driveway and had apparently attempted to access the backyard. When questioned, the man claimed that he needed to verify information related to a water heater located in the basement. The neighbor prevented him from proceeding and advised him to return when the tenants were present. Initially, I assumed that this individual was affiliated with the property management. That assumption, though, was disproven after direct confirmation with the landlord. Further discussion revealed that the individual was the previous owner of the property, who had sold the house several years earlier. Contact attempts between the landlord and also the former owner were pretty unsuccessful. No explanation was provided, and the matter appeared dormant for several days. But that all changed when, during a work break, I received a notification from my doorbell camera. 2 detectives from another state were at the front door requesting contact. They were attempting to locate the former owner in connection with outstanding warrants related to firearms theft and controlled substances or something. The address that we lived at was listed among the locations associated with him. After being informed of the earlier access attempt, the detectives expressed concern that items may have been concealed on the property prior to sale, and that the former owner was attempting retrieval. They advised securing all external access points to the basement immediately and exchanged contact information pending coordination with local authorities. Now, before any formal search could be arranged, the individual appeared again on 2 occasions. One instance was captured partially on camera, him knocking repeatedly at the front door while driving the same vehicle previously described. The footage, it was degraded due to low battery, but sufficient enough to identify him for sure. On another occasion, he contacted the landlord directly and provided a different justification for being on the property, this time claiming ownership of the abandoned structure in the yard. Shortly after that conversation, though, we discovered that the structure had been opened and its contents disturbed. Given the previous context, this was reported. Law enforcement conducted a full search of the basement, the crawl space, and the surrounding yard, but no contraband was located. But creepily enough, what they did find was a bunch of kids' clothes down there, in a sort of lockbox. Several months later, following a routine storm, a basement window was found damaged too. Entry signs were present inside of the lower level, items displaced, containers opened, and the unused water heater repositioned. This again was reported to local police, and the response this time was pretty minimal. The damage was attributed to weather, despite inconsistencies with other storm effects on the property. And at that point, several conclusions became pretty unavoidable. Access to the main living space was improbable without significant effort. The focus of the intrusions had constantly remained on that lower level. Law enforcement response was pretty limited and inconsistent. Nothing of value had been taken, but there was evidence of kids' clothes down there, which is really creepy. We reinforced the locks, altered routines, and we ceased using the basement entirely after that. Since the final confirmed incident, there has been no further activity. No sightings, no access attempts, and no damage, thankfully. But just to be clear, when I say kids' clothes, I don't just mean a few shirts or something. I mean like a whole load of different things. Like, if I had to put a number to it, I would say maybe like 30 or 40 different outfits for different kids. There were a lot of clothes down there. Some of them looked older than others, and I didn't touch them, and the police took them, so I don't know what happened to them, but again, if the police took them, that suggests something weird, right? In practical terms, the situation ended not because it was resolved through intervention or anything, but because the individual either recovered what he believed that he needed, or determined that it was just no longer accessible and maybe not worth the risk. The outcome for us was definitely not satisfying, but thankfully it was stable, and eventually we moved out, and we never heard anything after that. I was in the final year of my clinical training, completing a supervised placement required for professional registration. I was 28 at the time, newly relocated and living alone for the first time too. The move, it was temporary but demanding, and I had minimal social ties in the area. My focus was on work, study requirements, and maintaining a routine that followed me to function under long hours and some high stress. I'd grown up in a household where risk was quietly managed by others for the most part, and as a result, I did not actively assess my environment very often. I assumed safety as a default condition rather than something that required attention or planning. Now, on the day before the first incident, I returned to my unit to find structural modifications that I had not approved. My father, who lived several hours away, had assessed the property while I was out and installed timber braces across 2 windows and the rear sliding door. His explanation was brief and practical, as it always was with him. My reaction, though, was emotional and dismissive. I interpreted the action as intrusive rather than preventative and complained to my sibling about it during my drive to work. I intended to remove the barriers that evening, too. That plan was eventually delayed due to exhaustion and some poor judgment. But at approximately 3:40 in the morning, I was woken by repeated impacts against the bedroom window. The noise was not consistent with any environmental causes. It was rhythmic, forceful, and very close too. When I oriented toward the sound, I observed movement outside of the glass. 2 individuals were attempting to push the window inward. The window itself, it was poorly secured and would not have resisted sustained pressure. The only obstruction was the timber beam fixed across the interior frame, and because of that, the opening widened only partially. One person managed to force a lower limb through the gap, while the rest of his body remained outside. The second individual continued applying pressure from behind. Both were speaking loudly, and the statements were directed inward and explicitly threatening. I was unable to respond or move for several seconds, which I later understood as an acute stress response rather than indecision. Once I sort of regained partial control, I retreated into an interior space and contacted my partner. I didn't call emergency services directly. This was not a reasoned decision. It was avoidance driven by shock, really. My partner recognized the situation immediately, though, due to the background noise, and contacted authorities on my behalf while remaining on the line with me. The attempt, though, ended abruptly when the individuals abandoned the effort and left the area. Police arrived shortly afterward, and a report was taken. Officers were direct in explaining that without identification or apprehension, follow-up options were pretty limited. Additional patrols were requested for the surrounding streets for a short period, but really, that was about it. I did not remain alone in the unit for several weeks afterward. Family members and my partner, they alternated staying overnight, and this arrangement was unsustainable long-term, and so I eventually resumed staying alone out of necessity rather than confidence. Now, the second incident occurred on the first night that I was alone again, which is very odd. So I slept in the living area, avoiding rooms with direct exterior exposure at this point. I woke without an obvious trigger, and immediately noticed a stationary presence outside of the rear door. The curtains were partially closed, but the lower portion of a person's legs were visible on the patio. The individual was standing directly in front of the glass, facing inward. There was no movement, no attempt to enter, and no sound. This continued for some time, and I remained still, assessing whether the person could see me or not, and when I attempted to move away, the behavior changed. The door was suddenly struck repeatedly with force, followed by pulling motions intended to slide it open. The effort failed, though, due to a fixed wooden brace that was installed earlier across the interior track. Emergency services were contacted immediately this time, and responding officers arrived as the individual fled the property. He was detained nearby. Now, despite the arrest, the outcome did not provide meaningful resolution by any means. The individual was released within days. I was advised that long-term protection or prosecution was unlikely without additional evidence. My priority shifted then from accountability to removal from the situation altogether. I eventually negotiated early termination of my lease and relocated to a secure apartment complex to complete the remainder of my placement. Now, I'm pretty sure that I was being targeted by whoever these people were, and I am genuinely so glad that my father came over when he did and secured the place, because without it, I shudder to think what might have happened. The place that this happened has a population under 10,000. The town, it functioned almost entirely around a short commercial strip, 2 bars, a late-closing takeaway, a pharmacy, and a small transit shelter that serviced buses during the day only. After 9 p.m., public transport ceased here, and foot traffic dropped to pretty much zero. Now, my route home from work followed this strip for several minutes before transitioning into residential streets. The total walk, it was under 10 minutes, and I had done it alone many times without any incidents, and had come to treat it as routine rather than something requiring active attention. The date, it was January 1st, early morning, and I'd finished a late shift at a bar due to holiday trading hours. After closing, several staff members remained inside briefly for drinks while cleaning wrapped up, and by the time that I prepared to leave, it must have been around 2:45 in the morning. A colleague offered to walk with me, another suggested driving me part of the way, and I declined both in the end. My decision was based on impatience, not risk assessment, and so I left alone. The streets were empty that night. All nearby buses were closed, the lights were off, doors secured, and I walked without music and was smoking a bit, which was typical for me after work. Nothing unusual occurred until I approached the transit shelter beside one of the closed shops. A man was seated on the bench inside of the shelter, and this stood out only because of the time, really. The shelter was unlit, unused overnight, and positioned slightly back from the road, and as I drew closer, I recognized him as someone that I had served earlier in the evening. I didn't know his name, and I had no prior interaction with him beyond standard customer service, but I did recognize him. He was manipulating something in his hands, and as I passed, I noticed that he was inhaling a substance from a metal object. He looked up and addressed me directly, asking if I had a lighter on me. Because I was already smoking, I stopped without thinking. He stood as I reached into my bag. My intention was to hand him a lighter and continue walking immediately, but instead he asked for a cigarette too. I told him that I didn't have another one. During this exchange, he moved closer than was really appropriate. I suddenly became aware of just how isolated this location was. There were no vehicles and no open buildings and no visible residents for several hundred meters. I attempted to end the interaction verbally and physically by turning away, and he told me to wait. At that point, his tone changed. There was no raised voice, but the content shifted abruptly. He stated that he had been agitated all night and that he had been looking for someone to take it out on, apparently. He followed this with a remark that I should not be alone at this hour. This was not framed as advice, mind you, it was more observational, I would say. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I scanned the area and saw nothing that would interrupt or deter him. So I lied and told him someone was expecting me nearby. I named a boyfriend who was not present and implied proximity rather than location. He reacted with visible disbelief and said that he would walk with me to meet this person. I refused repeatedly, but he positioned himself behind and slightly to the side of me as I resumed walking. He spoke continuously, alternating between statements about being misunderstood and assurances that he was not a danger to me specifically. His proximity never changed, mind you. I didn't attempt to run. The streets were narrow and poorly lit, and I believed sudden movement would escalate the situation. So instead, I took out my phone under the pretext of checking messages and typed a short warning into a shared work chat. My battery level was critically low, unfortunately, and so I chose not to make a call because he was monitoring my movements closely and commented when I stopped listening to him. When we turned onto my street, his behavior shifted again. The language became explicitly sexual. He referenced my age, my appearance, and my supposed relationship. I didn't respond. I increased my walking speed incrementally. At this point, I realized allowing him to follow me to my actual address would create a long-term risk, even if nothing happened immediately. So, I selected a house with a visible interior light and opened the front gate without hesitation. I announced that this was my home and closed the gate between us. I approached the door and pretended to unlock it. I did not look back until I heard his footsteps retreat. Once he was no longer visible, I exited the gate and I just ran. But he noticed and followed for a short distance, but didn't close the gap. I reached my house seconds later and I was unable to enter because the internal lock was engaged, but my phone powered off while I was attempting to use it, and I knocked forcefully until my father finally answered. This incident was never reported. I could not really identify the man, and there was no physical contact or evidence of anything malicious happening. And so in the end, I just chose to no longer walk alone at night in that town. I never did see that man again after that, which again is a little bit strange because, as I mentioned earlier, the town is very small and, well, everyone knows everyone here. And I guess the lesson here is to just be more cautious and more prepared, because some outcomes can definitely be avoided by preparation. This occurred during a temporary stay in northern Argentina, in a semi-rural municipality outside of a regional hub. The area experiences frequent infrastructure interruptions here, including unplanned electrical outages, which are treated locally as inconveniences rather than emergencies. The residence was a single-story concrete structure on a fenced lot, shared with several animals. At the time, 3 people lived there: myself, my younger sibling, and our mother. Now, on the evening in question, the power failed shortly before midnight. This was not unexpected, and no attempt was made to restore it. With no lighting or internet access, I went to bed earlier than usual that day. My mother, though, remained awake, using her phone in an exterior seating area near the stairwell. The animals moved intermittently, but eventually they settled too. During this period, my mother was on a voice call with an individual that she knew casually through local contacts. At one point, he asked whether she was alone, and she answered affirmatively. Later, she stated that she interpreted the question narrowly and did not consider that it might be understood as confirmation that nobody else was present in the home. After ending the call, she secured the lower level, completed household tasks, and she eventually joined us in the shared sleeping area. All occupants were in the same room due to space constraints, and there were no exterior lights, no mechanical noises, and no active appliances due to the outage. Now, sometime around 1:30 in the morning, I woke to a repetitive sound consistent with deliberate knocking. This was followed by a short whistling pattern, and before I could react, my mother spoke quietly and instructed us not to move or to respond, and we complied. Movement was restricted intentionally, and the sleeping surface beneath me, it was suspended and produced audible noise with minimal motion. Any repositioning would have been detectable pretty quickly. The temperature was pretty hot that night, due to a lack of ventilation as well, but nobody moved. Over the next several minutes, the person outside moved across the property, and he attempted to get our attention at multiple points: a side entrance, the primary door, and a front-facing window. The sound suggested controlled handling of fixtures, consistent with someone attempting to test access while minimizing noise, and at one point, pressure was applied to the window frame, though no forced entry occurred. After a period of inactivity, the footsteps seemed to recede and no vehicles were heard, and so the property returned to silence. The response inside of the house was pretty diverged. My sibling and I remained awake, monitoring for further sounds. Our mother resumed sleeping within a short time, and when questioned later that night, she dismissed the event as likely animal-related, despite the absence of any barking or movement consistent with that explanation at all. But the following day, she disclosed additional information. The individual who had attempted to access the house, it was the same person who had contacted her earlier and asked whether she was alone or not. She acknowledged that the timing and the behavior indicated intent rather than coincidence. Her stated plan was to verbally warn him against returning and escalate only if the behavior repeated. AKA, she didn't really do anything. Thankfully, he never seemed to come back, and so we never heard anything again as far as I could tell. But still, when you go through something like this, it sits deep in your chest with you for a long time. This took place during a late evening stop in central Pennsylvania, in a rural location located roughly 40 minutes from a mid-sized city. The town has very limited commercial activity and very few people around after sunset. I was roughly about 26 years old at the time, and I wear a headscarf for religious reasons, which is pretty uncommon in that area, though this was not something that I initially considered as relevant. Anyway, I arrived shortly after 7 p.m. with my partner. We planned to share the drive, but intended to separate tasks in town. While he was handling some errands elsewhere, I chose to wait inside of a 24-hour diner near the highway. The establishment had a counter, several booths, and a large window facing the parking lot. I ordered a drink and occupied the same booth for about an hour, writing intermittently and checking my phone. The diner was sparsely populated. Staff remained behind the counter for the most part, and no other customers stayed for extended periods like I was. At some point during my stay, though, a vehicle parked directly outside of the window, adjacent to my booth. The engine remained running, and the headlights were on and oriented toward the glass. Initially, I didn't think much of it, assuming that it belonged to a staff member or somebody waiting for somebody else briefly. Several minutes later, though, the headlights brightened momentarily, and I sort of looked up, thinking that my partner had returned early. The vehicle was unfamiliar, though, so I resumed what I was doing, and I didn't move locations. In hindsight, the light changing appeared intentional rather than incidental, I think. Later, though, I noticed a man standing near the counter without interacting with any of the staff there. He was positioned in a place that allowed him to face both the dining area and the entrance. I didn't observe him ordering food or collecting anything, but when I looked up directly, he was focused on me. The attention was sustained and unbroken. There was no visible expression, but the posture and the eye contact suggested scrutiny rather than curiosity, I would guess. After a short interval, though, he repositioned himself closer to the entrance, partially obstructed by a divider wall. From that angle, he could still observe my booth using peripheral positioning, also while remaining closer to the doors in the parking lot. And it was at this point that I became aware of his movements without fully turning toward him. When I began gathering my belongings, he moved into the small entry space between the interior and exterior doors. I paused and checked my phone rather than standing immediately, and he remained there, oriented toward the exit, but tracking my movement with his head rather than his body. At that point, I chose not to leave. I walked instead toward the restrooms at the back of the building. As I changed direction, he turned enough to confirm that he was watching where I was going. I stayed inside of the restroom longer than necessary and waited for a message from my partner confirming that he had arrived. When I exited, the man had returned inside and was standing near the entrance again, facing outward. I passed him without engaging, and I moved through the entryway. He didn't step aside fully, though, leaving limited clearance, but did not physically block me. His attention remained fixed as I exited. Outside, the same vehicle remained parked near the door, and I walked past it and entered my partner's car, which was parked one space away. I opened both front and rear doors briefly while settling my belongings. And throughout this, the man stood near his vehicle and continued watching me like a hawk. As we left the lot and merged onto the highway, I looked back and saw him still facing the road. Shortly after, a vehicle pulled in closely behind us and maintained that distance longer than would be expected given open lanes. It was a dirty-looking van, and it exited the highway a short distance later. Thankfully, nothing further occurred and there was no direct confrontation. No words were exchanged, in fact, and no laws were broken in a way that could be reported clearly or conclusively, so really, that was that. And although the situation ended without any harm and without any consequences, I cannot shake the feeling that I was targeted that day. And maybe it was because I looked a little different in town and because I wear a headscarf or something. I'm not really sure, but it was strange, and I definitely did not feel safe in that moment, and they were planning something. During the summer of 2019, I was participating in a short-term academic exchange program in Germany. I was 18 years old and living in student housing arranged through the program. This was my first time residing outside of my home country without family supervision. The city had a reputation for strong public infrastructure and low rates of violent crime here, which influenced my assessment of personal risk at the time. One evening, after attending a late seminar, I boarded a regional S-Bahn line to return to my accommodation. It was about 9:45 in the afternoon and the train was moderately full, with commuters and students seated throughout the carriage. I had been on my feet most of the day and was physically fatigued. I took a seat near the center of the car and placed my bag on my lap. While waiting on the platform, I had noticed a middle-aged man standing several meters away who appeared to be watching me. This didn't immediately register as unusual. As a non-local student, I was pretty accustomed to occasional attention at the very least, especially due to differences in accent and appearance. Once inside of the train, though, I saw him enter through the same carriage but sit on the opposite side. Over the next several stops, I became aware that he was periodically looking in my direction. There was no attempt at conversation or visible signaling. I dismissed it and focused on my phone. At some point during the ride, though, likely after passing a transfer station, I fell asleep unintentionally. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I woke when the train slowed and announced an upcoming stop. And when I opened my eyes, I noticed that the man was now seated beside me. There was no verbal interaction, and I registered the change but didn't immediately react, assuming that the train had filled and the seats were limited. But as I leaned back, I felt pressure against my head as if I was being guided toward his shoulder. The contact was deliberate, but at the time my reaction was delayed due to fatigue and confusion rather than consent, and I moved slightly, but I did not confront him. A short while later, I became fully alert when I felt my arm being pulled. I was being lifted from the seat and directed toward the door as the train stopped. The man was applying force at my elbow and lower back, attempting to guide me off the carriage. Once on the platform, I pulled away and asked him in English what he was doing. He responded in broken English that he knew me and that I had missed my stop. He stated that he would help me to get home, and this was very untrue. I told him clearly that I didn't know him and that he needed to leave me alone. He attempted to reassert physical control by taking hold of my forearm and steering me toward an exit stairwell, but at that point, I raised my voice and said that I would contact transit security if he wouldn't let go. I also gestured toward a uniformed rail employee visible further down the platform. The change was immediate too. He released me, stepped back, and walked quickly in the opposite direction without further comment. Mind you, he didn't run, but he didn't look back either. I waited on the platform until another train arrived and I boarded a different carriage. I remained awake for the remainder of the journey, as you can probably imagine, and exited at my correct stop eventually, where I waited inside the station until other passengers were present before leaving. After that night, though, I never did fall asleep on public transport again, that's for sure. And I treated the whole situation as a bit of a learning curve, because I genuinely believe that if that man in uniform hadn't have been there, that I would have been in a lot of trouble. I was 18 years old and had recently finished secondary school. The campus housing was intended for first-year students coming from outside of the region, and it was my first experience living without daily family oversight. The decision had been debated extensively at home too, but it was ultimately approved on the condition that I remained focused on academics and maintained regular contact. The apartment complex was functional rather than social. Each floor had a shared kitchen, laundry room, and study area. Most residents kept to themselves too, and I settled in pretty quickly, learned the public transport routes, and established a routine between classes, part-time work, and study sessions. I also became close with a student named Lenka. who lived 2 floors above me. Several weeks after the semester began, a new tenant moved into the unit across the corridor from mine. I didn't initially register his presence too, beyond noticing that the hallway was busier during evenings. My first direct interaction with him too occurred in the shared kitchen when he introduced himself as Marek. The exchange was brief and pretty neutral. Over the next month too, Marek began appearing repeatedly during times that coincided with my schedule. He would enter the kitchen shortly after I arrived, or wait near the elevator when I left for class, or sit in the study area without using the facilities. At first I assumed that this was coincidence, caused by similar academic timetables. The first indication that this behavior was not incidental occurred when I received an unsigned note placed inside of my mailbox. It referenced my clothing and stated that I stood out more than I realized. There was no threat or request attached or anything, so I discarded it without reporting it. Shortly afterward, though, Marek appeared at the cafe where I worked in the evenings. He remained there for nearly the entirety of my shift, too, without ordering any additional items. When I asked if he needed anything else, he declined and asked questions about my work hours, commute, and whether I lived alone. I redirected the conversation, and eventually I ended it pretty professionally. From that point forward, though, the encounters became more frequent and less situational. He began waiting in the hallway outside my apartment door. He would attempt physical contact, such as brief embraces or touching my arm, framed as friendliness. When I questioned his behavior, he stated that he believed that we were closer than normal neighbors. After discussing the situation with Lenka and 2 other residents, I confronted him directly in a public area of the building. I stated clearly that the contact and the frequency of the interaction were very unwelcome and that I wanted no further communication. He appeared displeased with that, but he did acknowledge the request verbally. And for about 10 days, there were no other incidents. Then, upon returning from a weekend trip, I discovered items placed inside of my apartment that I had not purchased, including groceries that I had mentioned casually in conversation weeks earlier. There was no sign of forced entry. Building management later stated that maintenance access had been granted for plumbing inspections, though no work order had existed for my unit. The situation escalated decisively, though, one night in March when my doorbell rang shortly after 2:30 in the morning. Obviously, I didn't answer. A voice identified itself as Marek, though, and asked to speak with me before things went wrong. When I didn't respond, he began knocking repeatedly and even tried to open the door. I retreated to the bathroom and contacted emergency services. I remained on the line until security and police arrived. Marek was detained in the corridor, attempting to force entry. Officers documented damage to the lock and took my statement on site. Subsequent investigation, though, revealed that Marek had previously been removed from student housing in another city due to harassment complaints. He had also accessed my online presence through secondary accounts connected to university directories. I never did return to that apartment after that, and with the assistance from the program coordinator, I transferred to alternate housing and completed the academic year remotely after that. Since then, I've avoided single-occupancy living arrangements. The experience just really changed everything for me. A few years back, I arranged a rideshare pickup from a commercial plaza spot on the outskirts of a town that I was at to return to a family property where I was staying temporarily. The trip usually takes between maybe 35 to 40 minutes, depending on traffic, and I was familiar with at least 3 standard routes that remain on the highways for nearly the entire drive. The driver was an older man, likely in his late 50s, I would say. The vehicle details matched the app, and the ride began without any immediate concerns. During the first portion of the trip, he initiated casual conversation, asking about my work, how long I was visiting for, and whether I lived locally or not. His tone was pretty neutral and not aggressive at all. and after several minutes I indicated that I was going to listen to audio and put on some earbuds, which effectively ended the interaction. Now, about 12 minutes into the ride, I noticed the vehicle diverging from the route that I was expecting. Initially, I didn't respond. Alternate paths are common due to traffic adjustments, right? And the navigation indicator still showed the trip progressing toward the destination. However, the deviation continued and the environment changed from suburban streets to sparsely developed roads with not much around. I opened the app's live map and compared it to my own navigation. The route being taken did not correspond with any suggested path anymore. The road narrowed significantly and transitioned from a maintained surface to older pavement with no markings. There were some isolated residents set far back from the road, but there were no pedestrians and there was now no passing traffic either. At this point, I removed my earbuds and began monitoring the drive more actively. The driver didn't speak and didn't acknowledge the change in the route either. The navigation indicator showed the vehicle moving away from the estimated arrival path rather than adjusting toward it. The road terminated in what appeared to be a service access spot too. And instead of turning around, the driver steered onto an unmarked gravel path branching off to the right. This path passed behind private properties and into a wooded area, and it was not listed on any roadway in the app or on my phone's navigation software too. I asked the driver why we were leaving the main road, and he stated that the navigation system had redirected him and that the paved road was just ahead. I responded that I was uncomfortable continuing on the current path and requested that we return to the public road instead. He acknowledged the statement by nodding his head, but did not alter the direction of travel. The vehicle continued along the gravel track for several minutes. The surface was uneven and narrow, really inconsistent with a maintained roadway. The driver remained silent and focused forward. Based on the layout and the turns, it appeared the route required prior familiarity rather than any reliance on automated navigation. I unlocked my phone and prepared to initiate a call if needed. I repeated my request to return to a standard road. The driver again stated that we would reconnect shortly. The pathway eventually reconnected with a secondary paved road, apparently used by local traffic, and within another 2 turns, we did return to a populated route with visible vehicles and street signage. But only after this transition did the driver resume conversation, making comments about how navigation systems sometimes choose odd shortcuts, and suggesting that the route was unintended. I didn't respond to that and remained alert for the remainder of the trip, which was about another 15 or so minutes, and I kept my hand near the door handle and monitored the map continuously after this. I can assure you, too, that the road that we were on was leading away from the destination that I was trying to get to, not toward it. Like, it was in a completely different direction. So, I know for a fact that it wasn't a shortcut or anything, and that the GPS would have been telling him to go back and turn around the whole way. In any case, the driver made no further route changes and did not attempt additional conversation, too. After exiting the vehicle too, I reviewed the trip data, and the detour was not logged as an alternative route by the rideshare platform, and the gravel path was not identified as recognized road in any mapping service that I checked, which meant that the deviation increased the total travel time rather than reducing it, but he never charged for it either. I did report the incident through the app, documenting the route discrepancy and the refusal to return to a public road when requested, but I never did hear back as to what happened to that guy apart from some generic email. This happened during a school holiday period when I was staying at my family home in Canada. I was 14 years old at the time. The house was a single-story structure with a central living area and a short interior corridor connecting the bedrooms and a home office. Some temporary furniture adjustments had been made for seasonal decorations, which altered typical sightlines within the house at the time. But one evening, my parents and I were watching a movie together in the living room. The lights were off except for the television and a decorative light source near a far corner of the room. I was seated in a position where I had a sort of unobstructed view into the hallway, which was not normally the case. The hallway connected a bathroom, my bedroom, my parents' bedroom, and a small office at the end. And at some point during the movie, I just became very anxious all of a sudden. Mind you, there was no noise or movement that initially triggered it, but after scanning the living room and seeing both parents focused on the TV, I looked down the hallway. Due to the low lighting there, visibility was pretty limited, but sufficient enough to distinguish movement. And I observed a dark humanoid-shaped figure, like an outline, partially visible near the doorway of my parents' bedroom. The figure was stationary at first and then shifted position, becoming more visible. No facial features or clothing were discernible, only general height and posture. The duration of the observation was brief, but clear enough for me to register it as a person rather than a shadow artifact. Upon seeing it, I was terrified too. My heart began to race, and I didn't know what to do. The figure then moved fully into the hallway, paused momentarily, and proceeded toward the office at the end of the corridor. The movement was controlled, deliberate, smooth, and really weird. After several seconds of just my jaw being dropped and me just sort of sitting there watching this thing, I interrupted the movie and informed my parents that somebody was inside of the home. My father turned on all the lights and checked the hallway and office immediately. The office had no external access points and no windows, and he reported finding nothing and no signs of forced entry or disturbance or anything. No further action was taken that night. The movie resumed, though the atmosphere was definitely subdued. I didn't sleep well that night, and I remained alert for sounds in the hallway for hours. Later that night too, while in bed, I heard footsteps moving toward my room from the living area. This was not completely unusual, as my father occasionally checked in on me at night. The footsteps stopped outside of my door, and I then heard a brief tapping sound on the door, followed by movement pacing back and forth along the hallway. The pattern continued for quite a long time without the door ever opening, and I didn't respond or investigate. The following morning, I asked my father whether he had come into my room during the night, and he said that he had not left his bedroom after going to sleep that night. And after that, there was no follow-up discussion. Now, about 2 years later, another incident occurred. I was home during the day and went to restart a laundry cycle in the basement. The basement was partially finished, with the laundry area located beyond a guest room. Lighting required that you flick a switch at the basement stairs, and while descending the stairs, I swear that I heard my name called from the direction of the laundry area. And the voice, it matched my mother's in tone and cadence. At that moment, though, I knew that my mother was upstairs in the kitchen. I sort of paused, and I didn't proceed any further because I was so confused. I verbally responded once to confirm, then heard the same voice request assistance from the laundry area. No lights were on in that part of the basement, though, and I immediately ran upstairs, closed the door, and encountered my mother moments later in the kitchen. She confirmed, too, that she had not called for me and had not been in the basement all day. After this moment, I always avoided being alone in the basement whenever possible. I never did hear voices again, but intermittent unexplained household noises were pretty common. Primarily footsteps during nighttime hours, continued sporadically over the following years. Eventually we did move, and I was really thankful for that, but years later I was having discussions with my parents about the past, and I sort of brought some of this stuff up, and they also acknowledged that at the time they heard things too. They said that they never told me because they never wanted to scare me, but that was confirmation enough for me to know that there was something weird going on in that house, and I really don't know how to explain it. So I was in my apartment about a month or maybe 2 months ago. My roommate just texted me and told me that he was going to head on to work. And about 5 minutes after that, I get up from my desk, I have a gaming PC that's barely holding itself together, and go toward the kitchen for a refill on my coffee. I leave my room and I'm coming down the hall toward the kitchen and the entrance to my place, when I see a shadow being cast onto the rug at the entrance from someone standing in my kitchen. I even hear someone moving around the silverware, forks, butter knives, that kind of thing. My first thought was my roommate hasn't left just yet, and I say, "Hey man, you still here?" and continue walking towards the kitchen and the entrance. The whole time there's sounds of like a chain jingling and a buzzing sound sort of. I round the corner expecting to see him, but when I do, no one is in my kitchen. So my second thought is that it must have been my dog. It roams free in the apartment and has his harness on, so maybe it was him shaking her clothes or something. It roams free in the apartment and has this harness on, so maybe it was shaking clothes? I wait a second for the dog to come out the other side of the kitchen, but after about 5 seconds, I'm becoming very puzzled. With furrowed eyebrows and a confused frown on my face, I lean in to look out of the peephole on the door to see what's going on outside of my apartment door, and I still hear the jingling chain and the footsteps, almost like someone was walking a large dog past my front door. Whatever it is that's happening, I don't see anyone though, so I assume it's something happening out of view out there, and I just sort of shrug my shoulders and like, oh well, right? But here's the weird part. I turn around and am immediately faced with what I'm going to describe as a grey, leaning around the corner with one 3-fingered hand touching the wall. It looks insubstantial, but like it's made of smoke or fog. I gasp and take a step back, and it ducks back around the corner without a sound. I start saying things like, "It's okay, you can come out, I won't hurt you, and I'm sorry, you just startled me." Of course, there's no reply. I go up and inspect the corner where I saw it, and there isn't enough room for someone to stand there and peek around, much less to hide from someone coming into the apartment. There's like 4 inches of clearance between the edge and the TV, so unless someone was like 2 inches wide, they just wouldn't fit there. And look, I know as well as you that it sounds crazy as heck, but I swear that it's the truth of what happened. Maybe it's stress and I hallucinated it. Completely possible. Maybe I'm actually sick and need medication for some kind of chemical imbalance. I mean, I don't want to be a schizophrenic, but it's possible, right? And yes, before you ask, before that and every single night since, I see things out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Not once have I felt threatened or afraid. I remember watching this YouTube video about lizard people having wardrobe malfunctions on live TV. I know it's probably all bunk, but I enjoy a good conspiracy theory as much as the next guy. It's entertainment. But I really just don't want to be the crazy guy. I watched this video and honestly didn't have a single thing on my mind when the encounter began. I just recall that was what I was doing when it started. I figure that I'm probably going to get a bunch of people probably doubting things and saying hateful stuff, and I can't help that or how I feel. The only thing that I can do is just try to be honest with the world and with myself. I may be cracking it, who knows, but this is what happened. I swear on it. I'm a 36-year-old female in Sweden. I've worked in mental health care for the last 18 years, mainly with people with psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia. I was working at a group home for 9 years and was very close with my co-workers there, especially 2 females. The last few years I worked there, another female started working there too. Her name was M, and the 4 of us grew very close. She was very timid, shy, friendly at times, and we got along pretty well. She was, however, often on long-term sick leave because of her own mental health issues, so we didn't meet much at work. but she always showed up at our after-work dinners, so we continued to stay in touch, even when she wasn't well enough to work full-time. She told us that she had a history of schizophrenia herself, just like the patients that we were treating, but that she was medicated and hadn't had any psychotic episodes for years. Now, since I have an education in psychiatry and a long experience with schizophrenia, I have no judgment towards people suffering from the illness, and it didn't bother me being friends with someone who had a diagnosis like that. And even after what I tell you, I still feel the same way. In the summer of 2023, I had moved on to work in a new place, also with mental health, but this time forensic psychiatry, like a halfway house for mentally ill murderers, etc. The four of us stayed in touch and still met every now and then for dinner parties and whatnot. Em told us that she had been evicted from her apartment because of an incident where she had accidentally entered her neighbor's apartment in the middle of the night. She told us that in the huge apartment complex, the doors all looked exactly the same, and that she simply walked in the wrong door by accident, and that the neighbors, they'd created a bit of a scene out of pure drama and reported her to the police. I somehow felt that while that sounded out of proportion to evict someone just from that perhaps the landlord took that kind of action because he judged her based on her medical history, and I felt honestly bad for her. I questioned her if something else happened, and she claimed that it didn't and that this was the full story. In Sweden, it's very difficult to get a contract for an apartment when you've gotten evicted before. You pretty much get blacklisted and that's that. So Em asked if she could move in with me. Since she was literally on the street, literally homeless, I said, well, of course you can. I've always gotten myself into uncomfortable situations by saying yes instead of thinking about myself, and had no idea just how severe this situation would get when I said yes to Em. So I live in a pretty small apartment. It's one bedroom that pretty much only fits a bed and a desk, a living room that fits a couch and a TV, no room for an extra bed, a small kitchen and a small bathroom, and I have 2 cats too. We decided that Em was going to live in the living room, and I offered her to throw my couch out so she could have a bed there, but she said that she was fine with sleeping on the couch since it's comfortable enough. I insisted on giving her a bed, but she always declined. There's a door between the living room and the bedroom too, but between the living room and the hallway, there's just an open arch, so she wouldn't have total privacy by any means. But I hung up a thick velvet curtain covering the arch, so at least that gave her the sense of a door and more privacy than nothing. There's another door from my bedroom to my kitchen too, so I have 2 doors to my bedroom. I have to have one of them open at night since my cats want to go in and out, and they also have their litter boxes in the bathroom, and food and water in the kitchen. I naturally kept the kitchen door open and not the living room door, since that's where Em lived and we wanted to keep our privacy somehow. She wasn't working at this time because she was on one of her long-term sick leaves. This while I was working shifts, so sometimes I had to get up at 6 a.m. and sometimes I didn't get home until like 11 p.m. I have really severe insomnia too, and I need to combine medication to just get to sleep. And even with this, I still wake up easily. I told her that I would appreciate if she could try to stay quiet those nights when I have to get up at 6 in the morning, but that it's fine if she's loud when I'm at work or when I'm doing the evening shifts because then I don't need to sleep as much. Now, she was a heavy smoker and a coffee drinker, so I bought her a coffee machine. Yeah, I know, I'm a bit of a weirdo who doesn't drink coffee very often, so I didn't have one. But I did this to make her enjoy her living situation a little more. The coffee machine in the sink is placed right outside of my bedroom door. Like I said, the kitchen is pretty small. So the first night together, I had to get up at 6 for my shift. As usual, I had a hard time falling asleep. Em had been up several times that night to go out to smoke, and I woke up every single time. At 5 a.m., she started making coffee, and since it's literally outside of my bedroom door, I was wide awake from the sounds of it. I asked her in the nicest way possible why she was up this early, asking if she had any plans today. I mean, she's on sick leave, so why not sleep at 5 a.m. if you can? And she just said that she couldn't sleep. I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. I would just appreciate if you could wait with making the coffee till 6 a.m. since I really need this last hour of sleep because of work. Also, adding to why I need my sleep is that I have epilepsy that gets really bad when I don't get enough sleep. I usually get lots of seizures when I don't get at least 4 hours of sleep. I knew that I would probably get seizures at work now, meaning that this day would be both stressful and potentially dangerous for me since there's a huge risk that I fall and hurt myself. And it's really not a good thing to get cramps and seizures among mentally unstable criminal clients who you're supposed to care for. And look, I know it's not an ideal situation to work in that field with my condition, and I can inform you all that I did quit after only 6 months. Anyway, she said that she really wanted a coffee with her cigarettes, but that she would try to wait the next time that I have to work. I accepted it, and I went on with my day, but things just didn't get any better. She continued to wake me up early in the morning and through the nights, and continued to promise to stop, but insisted that she really wanted coffee with her cigarettes. I suggested making the coffee the night before or drinking iced coffee or Coke instead, but she didn't want that. I should add too that she demanded for me to be silent at 10 p.m. because that's when she wanted to sleep, and genuinely I respected that. She used to get these moments of binge eating too, where she would empty my fridge and pantry from everything that I had. I remember this one time when I bought a big loaf of bread, and she texted me 30 minutes after I left the apartment saying, "Hey, I'm sorry I ate your loaf of bread. I'll buy it back once I get money." Like an entire loaf of bread in 30 minutes. I had told her when she moved in to feel at home and what's mine is yours, so I couldn't really get mad at that, but it did start to annoy me for 2 reasons. I mean, it was getting kind of expensive since it was such huge amounts, and it was always in inconvenient times of the day, like after an evening shift when the store was closed and I came home hungry, and she had emptied the kitchen from literally everything that I had bought the same day. Em also had long black hair that was absolutely everywhere, all over the sink, the floor, the bathtub. I'm no clean freak, but I think anyone could understand that this isn't the nicest thing to step into or see everywhere in your house. She also left her fingernails and toenails on the bathroom floor. There were also pee drops on the toilet seat every time that she had been to the toilet too. I saw a silverfish on my bathroom floor. Never ever seen one before. They eat hair and skin and nails and whatnot, so I figured that this fella probably enjoyed life because of the new dirty conditions my bathroom was in. At first, I didn't want to say it straight out because I thought that it would hurt her and I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. So I just put a broom and shovel in the bathroom to imply that we needed to sweep the floor more often. This didn't seem to work, so after a while, I told her in the nicest way possible with a smile on my face, "Do you think we could try to clean the floor in the bathroom more often? We tend to lose some hair when we brush it, and I'm afraid that we might get pests. I saw a silverfish the other day, and I don't want it to get worse." I always made sure to say we instead of you, so she wouldn't feel attacked, and she promised to think about it, but nothing changed. Now, I started dating a guy around this time, and was head over heels for him. He was also in a roommate situation, so we had a tough time getting any alone time. I asked Em if there was any chance that we could get one night to ourselves every now and then in the apartment, and that she of course would get the apartment to herself as well. She didn't like the idea and claimed that she had nowhere to go, no friends or family. Now, I wasn't asking her to leave for 24 hours or anything, just a few hours so we could just get some quality time together. She could just go to the library or take a walk or whatever. I mean, I was at work for like 8 to 10 hours, 5 days a week, so she got a lot of time to herself. One of our old co-workers realized that this was really tearing at my mood, to never get any time for myself, and I started feeling really suffocated. She offered that Em could stay the night at her place. After all, they were friends too. Em said that she didn't want to bother her, but we told her that she didn't. They're friends. She's more than welcome, and I really just want one night to myself and my guy after all. I didn't understand why she made such a big deal over leaving me and the apartment for just one night. She eventually accepted and spent the night there, and I spent the night away the next week so that she could go and get more alone time too. And when I came home the next morning from my night away, I saw that my cat's water bowl was completely dried out. There was no spill on the floor, and it looked like it had been wiped out with a towel or paper or something. I had filled it up to the brim just the night before. I asked her how this was possible, and she said that the cats must have tipped it out, but there was nothing on the floor, like I said. But my cats are overly social and usually cuddle up with strangers after just a few minutes, and I noticed that the cats withdrew from her more and more over time, and the last couple of weeks, they never left my bedroom except from when they ate or used the litter box or whatever. It honestly seemed like they were scared of her, which I couldn't figure out since she was just so timid. I had this old saucepan from the 60s that meant a lot to me too. You probably wonder how a saucepan can mean a lot to someone, right? But it was my grandmother's, and it's really the only thing that I have that belongs to her. My mother used to cook for me with it when I was little, so it has a great nostalgic value to me. She burnt it one day and made no attempt to clean it. She left it on the stove and went out to smoke. I found it ruined, and I cried that day. She didn't even say that I'm sorry. She also broke dishes several times and didn't bother to replace them or apologize. This added to my frustration with her naturally, and it had been probably, 2 months had gone by now, and she kept waking me up at night, kept binge eating my food, never cleaned, never left the house, scared my cats and ruined my things. I realized too that she stole my prescripted sleeping pills at one point, lots of them as well, and I only get one per night, not more or less, and as you already know, I really need them. I had 20 of them in my nightstand when I left for work, and when I came home, they were gone. She denied this, which is pretty hilarious since nobody else could have been there. But my frustration was getting heavy. The summer heat was strong, and I felt locked up in my tiny bedroom with my 2 cats, never getting any time to myself, never any time alone with the guy that I was dating, except for once every 14th day. My apartment was messy and she was stealing from me. All of this was beginning to culminate. But one day, out of nowhere, my old elementary school classmate texted me on Facebook asking me how I know Em. He had seen that I had posted on Facebook that we were roommates now. I told him that we were old co-workers and that she needed a place to stay because she got evicted. He said, I know, but do you know why she was evicted? Yeah, she accidentally went into her neighbor's apartment. He said, that's not the full story. She broke in and snuck up to their sleeping baby with a knife in her hand, but luckily the father woke up and wrestled her down and managed to save the baby. Thankfully, nothing happened, but it was definitely a close call. I felt sick to my stomach. Could this be true? It would certainly explain why she was evicted, but it just sounded so horrible. And she is such a timid, nice girl. I had so many questions. But my friend had the full police report. Apparently the couple that Em had broken into was his ex-girlfriend and her family. It seemed that Em had a psychosis episode during the break-in, but those parts weren't public. It was, however, clear to me that she had been lying to me about why this had happened, and about how long she had been mentally unstable for. I started getting quite paranoid now, and I was already very frustrated with everything, and it was around this time that I really wanted her to move out. We did, however, have a contract that she had 30 days notice, and I knew that if I asked her in a harsh way that it would mean 30 days of chaos until she moved out. So I wanted to handle this as nicely as I could. I started looking for cheap hostels for her that I could suggest to her so she wouldn't be on the streets. I sat down with her and told her that I loved living with her and I feel really horrible for this, but I just miss my alone time and that the apartment is too small for 2 people. I said it wasn't personal and that I wouldn't want to live with anyone right now and that I wished it would have worked out and that I'm really sorry and hope that we can still remain friends. She looked absolutely crushed and said that it wasn't possible. I showed her the hostel that I found and said that I understood that it wasn't the ultimate situation, but I really needed her to move out because I felt suffocated, and also the summer heat was making it tough to always have the door to the bedroom closed, and that it was tough for me to not get my sleep, etc. She said okay. She was going to try and move out, but not until 30 days had passed, and I said of course to this. The first night after our talk, she got up and made her coffee at 2:30 in the morning. I nearly had a mental breakdown that night. I mean, I was going to get up at 6 and I couldn't go back to sleep. I asked her in the morning for probably the 10th time to not make coffee until I get up, but she didn't even answer me that time. She just sat in the sofa and stared out the window. I said, "Em?" and she kept staring. I was a little bit freaked out by that, but I left for work. She kept being weird though, kept making a mess, kept waking me up, kept eating my food, and all I could think about was the incident with her and the baby and the knife and all that. I eventually got so ticked off about being woken up by the coffee maker, I plugged it out and stored it in my attic, which she had no access to. It may have been childish, I know that, but I was just genuinely getting so tired at this moment. My sleeping pills were stolen and I was starting to feel like Edward Norton in the beginning of the Fight Club. Well, the next night, I woke up at 4 a.m. by her making coffee in a saucepan. Not my grandmother's saucepan, thankfully. That one was ruined. I tried talking to her again, explaining the situation, but she just stared and didn't reply. Me being frustrated and on the tipping point, took the saucepan and stored it in the attic as well. I know, but I was going crazy and just wanted her to stop with this nightly coffee routines and to just get the hint. The third night, I had the guy that I was dating sleeping at our place because I was getting really paranoid now over her weird behavior, not speaking with me and just staring into space. I woke up from my very light snooze by him poking me, and he whispered, "Look." And in the doorway, Em was just standing silently, staring at us. Honestly, this was like a scene from a horror movie, with her long black hair over her face. I kid you not. I didn't say anything at first, because I wanted to know if she just stood there for a second doing something by the door. But I realized after a while that she was actually just standing still staring at us. It reminded me of the ending of Paranormal Activity when Katie just stares at Micah in the final scene. So I sat up and said, "What are you doing?" But before I could finish the sentence, she just slammed the door shut, and I heard the sound of something metal falling on the floor and her running into the living room. I yelled out, "You need to leave," and started crying hysterically because this was turning into a nightmare. Of course, I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I was really happy that I had company that night too. I just kept asking myself, had she done this before? Stared at me in my sleep like that? The next day, when I got out of bed, I opened the door that she had slammed shut and saw a kitchen knife on the floor. So that was the metal sound that I had heard before she ran off that night. At this point, I took all of my knives and locked them in the attic as well. I then asked a friend of mine to come to my house and be here when I tell her that she has to move out immediately, that I can no longer wait 30 days. We were 27 days in. And during the conversation, I really tried to stay calm. I know that she has a mental illness. I know that she means no harm. And even though I was just so frustrated, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. I was mostly scared and tired, I guess, but she, however, didn't even answer when I talked to her. She just kept staring at the window. She left the apartment and she sent me a text instead, saying that I was disrespectful for bringing a friend over to her place. I came and I thought that this would be a quiet night finally. No coffee maker or saucepans. But at 3 a.m. I woke up by her burning dry coffee powder in a frying pan. At this moment, I just felt terrified of her. Her face was dead, her eyes were black. I suspected that she had gone into psychosis. I stopped the fire and she just ran off to the living room in silence. I knew that she had an appointment with her psychiatrist the next day, and while she was away, I packed all of her things. I then sent her a text telling her that she needs to pick them up and give me back my keys, and that I'll give her money for a hostel the upcoming 26 days. She didn't reply though. The guy that I was seeing came to keep me company in case she would fight about it. She didn't. She left the keys without looking at us and she just left. Our co-workers who were friends with us both told me that she moved in with a guy that she was dating apparently, and she stayed there for a few weeks until she somehow amazingly got an apartment of her own. She started working again, and genuinely I was really happy to hear this. She seemed to be doing pretty well. Then, in January of this year, one of our old co-workers told me that Em had called her and told her everything must burn, that she has a baby that she must save, and other delusional stuff. She had called 112, Swedish emergency number, like 911, about this, but they hadn't taken it seriously. Em had then proceeded to burn her entire apartment down because the voices in her head were telling her that she has to burn everything to save her friends and family. Her neighbors had tried to rescue her from the fire, but she had fought them off and ran back in and poured liquor on the fire to make it burn more. She was arrested and sentenced last week for aggravated arson. She'll serve her time in a mental institution or prison for a long time, possibly forever even. What's ironic is that she will probably be in the facility where I used to work and end up where she used to work herself. My old co-worker was a witness at the trial, and apparently she had stopped taking her medication because she thought that it made her feel numb, and she thought that she was stable enough to function without it, but obviously not. She had also stopped taking her medication the last few weeks when she stayed at my house, so when she stared blankly into space, she was going into psychosis. When she stared at me with a knife in her hand, when she burnt the frying pan that last night too, she was in a state of psychosis. It's really disturbing to think about what could have happened to me and my cats if she would have stayed too, or if I had been a heavy sleeper. I also think about what would have happened to that baby that she snuck into before she was evicted. And yeah, I know it's crazy that I didn't just throw her out by then, but it was very complicated. The reason why I haven't been able to talk about it with my friends is because they sympathize with her and have minimized my experience, and they think that I'm making a bigger deal out of it than it actually has been. I sort of understood it too, since they have never seen that darkness in her eyes that I saw that last couple of days. So really, I can't blame them, I guess. Also, I remembered something recently too that I wanted to add. There were several times when I was going to work early in the morning that she occupied the bathroom by taking long baths. I patiently tried to wait until the last minute before knocking and asking her if she could get up and get back in after I had gotten ready and left for work. It's just another thing that added to my frustration. I fell really ill one time when she was staying here too. I don't know at the time what it was, but I woke up in the early morning one day feeling very nauseated. On my way to the bathroom, I literally almost had a heart attack and threw up at the same time because it takes like 10 seconds to get to the bathroom, so you can imagine how bad it was when I didn't even make it. And I had a really high fever and kept throwing up, and I was just a mess. Obviously, you would understand too that you would want your bathroom to yourself at this point. Actually, I think it's pretty understandable that you'd want to be completely alone when you're just this ill, right? My head was spinning, and I'm guessing I was nearly hallucinating from the high fevers. But one random thing I laugh about today is that it was Eurovision week, and for some reason the flute solo from Moldova's song was stuck on repeat in my head while I was in and out of fever dreams. I have a hard time listening to it today because of this, but anyway, working in healthcare, I also have a natural instinct of not wanting to spread infections, so my first thought was that besides wanting to be alone, I didn't want to risk giving whatever this was to Em. So I begged her the moment that I noticed I was ill to please leave for her own sake. I mean, I could barely speak because it made me throw up that easily, and Our friend in common had asked her to water her plants that week, so she had the keys to her place and could have been alone there. But Em refused to leave, and I swear if I had the energy to slip out of the window and to fall to my death, I would have, but I couldn't. Anyway, I was half sitting or half laying on the toilet with a bucket on my lap, my head sort of resting in the bucket of puke because I just couldn't hold it up with the high fever, and I just begged through whispers for her to leave so she wouldn't be as ill as I was too. I told her, "What if you get sick soon too? We can't share the toilet. I'll be here all day. You should go to her place before it's too late, please." Eventually, she left, really ticked off at me. It turned out that I had a severe case of food poisoning, and I was well again after 2 days, but man, the fact that she refused to leave is something I felt I had to add to the story because it just made me so frustrated. Also, that reminded me that she used to shut my cats inside of my bedroom while I was away at work or whatever. She did this so that they couldn't eat, drink, or use the litter boxes. She claimed that she just recently closed it because she was trying to sleep, but I remember that she did it in the middle of the day one time, the last few days too, so she was lying about that for sure. Anyway, I could genuinely just go on and on about this whole situation, but that's the story, and thankfully, I survived.